Welcome the anointed ones. The most unsettling discoveries are never shouted. They're written quietly in reports no one was meant to read. At first, nothing about this situation looked dramatic. No explosions, no confrontations, no public fallout. Just a routine decision to keep an eye on you. Because when people don't understand someone, their instinct isn't curiosity, it's surveillance. They assumed it would be simple. Hire a few observers, track behavior, gather notes, connect patterns, close the file. That's how these things usually go. Efficient, predictable, almost boring. Except this time, every single report came back saying the same thing. Not in the same words, but with the same nervous undertone. Same pauses in explanation. Same discomfort hiding behind professional language. The kind of discomfort that makes people clear their throat before continuing, or suddenly get very interested in their coffee cup. One observer even tried to pad the report with extra details, like adding seasoning to a dish that still tasted wrong. It didn't help. Here's a fact most people don't like to hear. Observation works best on people who are unconsciously performing. Studies in behavioral psychology show that once someone stops seeking approval or reacting on cue, predictive accuracy drops sharply. Translation: the moment a person no longer lives for feedback, they become very hard to track and borderline impossible to control. That's not theory, that's documented, and that's where things got awkward. Because they weren't watching chaos, they weren't watching instability. They were watching someone who didn't do what was expected when it was expected, someone who didn't flinch when pressure was applied, someone who responded late, early, or not at all, and somehow still landed on their feet. It's the kind of thing that makes professionals start using vague phrases like unusual composure and inconsistent predictability, which is corporate language for we don't know what to do with this. There's a strange moment when surveillance stops feeling powerful and starts feeling pointless. When the people observing realize they're working harder than the person being observed. When the notes get longer, but the conclusions get thinner. When monitoring turns into mild existential confusion, followed by an unspoken agreement to stop pretending this is normal. And the funniest part, you weren't trying to be difficult, you weren't making a statement, you were just living, without reading the script they assumed you'd follow. That alone was enough to unsettle everyone involved, because when every person paid to watch you comes back saying the same unsettling thing, it's no longer about what you did, it's about what they couldn't explain. Number 1. They reported that you couldn't be psychologically mapped. They went in confident, almost casual about it. Mapping people is usually easy because most humans leave trails, emotional habits, predictable reactions, repeated fears, the same buttons getting pushed over and over again. That's how profiles are built. Observe long enough and the person starts outlining themselves for you. Except you didn't do that. The more they watched, the less clear the picture became. They expected patterns and got contradictions instead. You stayed calm where stress should have shown up. You disengaged where attachment was expected. You didn't escalate when pressure increased, and you didn't collapse when support disappeared. From the outside, that looks small. From an analytical point of view, it's disturbing, because behavior that doesn't line up with stimulus breaks the entire system they rely on. What really unsettled them wasn't that you were unpredictable. It was that your unpredictability wasn't chaotic. There was no emotional mess, no impulse spirals, no visible panic underneath the surface. You weren't reacting randomly. You were responding selectively. That tells them you weren't being driven by instinct or fear. You were choosing. They tried different angles, stress tests, silence, subtle provocation, social pressure, time delays. Each time, the result shifted just enough to stay unreadable. What worked once didn't work again. Any temporary insight expired quickly. That's when the language in the reports changed. Less confidence, more qualifiers. Words like inconsistent, hard to categorize, and non-standard responses. Those are polite ways of saying the usual tools failed. The uncomfortable truth is this: systems depend on people being emotionally accessible. When someone isn't easily offended, easily flattered, easily threatened, or easily guilted, control starts slipping. You didn't give them a fixed emotional address. There was no stable doorway into your mind. And without that, mapping becomes guesswork. At some point, observation turns into frustration, because the longer they watched, the clearer one thing became: you weren't hiding anything. There was no secret mask to pull off. This was just how you were, self-contained, internally referenced, not shaped by constant external input. That's why this scared them. Not because you were mysterious, but because you were complete without explanation. A person who doesn't need to be understood to function can't be reduced to a profile. And a person who can't be profiled can't be managed the way everyone else is. Number 2. They said your reactions were delayed in a way that felt intentional. What stood out wasn't that you reacted slowly. It was that your timing felt deliberate, almost strategic, without looking rehearsed. Most people respond immediately when something hits them, emotionally or mentally. They defend, explain, apologize, or attack. You didn't. You let moments sit. You let words hang in the air. You let situations unfold without rushing to control the narrative. That delay confused them, because delay usually signals uncertainty or fear. Yours didn't carry either. They watched closely, expecting the pause to crack under pressure. It never did. You didn't fill silence to relieve discomfort. You didn't rush to clarify yourself when misunderstood. You didn't chase resolution just to restore peace. Instead, you waited long enough for outcomes to reveal themselves. By the time you spoke or acted, the situation had already shifted. People had exposed intentions. Assumptions had collapsed on their own. Your response arrived after the dust settled, not while everyone else was still swinging. That's what made it feel intentional. Your timing consistently landed where it had the most impact with the least effort. Not because you planned every move, but because you weren't emotionally hijacked by the moment. You weren't reacting to noise, you were responding to meaning. That difference matters more than people realize. Observers rely on immediate feedback to measure influence. Quick reactions confirm control. Delayed reactions disrupt it. When someone doesn't respond right away, others start projecting. They overthink. They fill the gap with their own fears and motives. The delay becomes a mirror, and most people don't like what they see in it. Your silence didn't comfort them, it unsettled them. They noticed that once you did respond, it wasn't dramatic. It was concise, grounded, often final. There was no need to revisit or rehash. You didn't argue in circles. You didn't explain yourself into exhaustion. You said what needed to be said and moved on. That made earlier pressure attempts look unnecessary in hindsight. What truly bothered them was realizing your timing couldn't be rushed. You couldn't be baited into premature reactions. You couldn't be pushed into emotional deadlines. You moved on internal readiness, not external urgency. And that kind of pacing quietly flips the power dynamic. Because when someone controls their timing, they control their energy. And when energy isn't handed over on demand, observation stops feeling like oversight and starts feeling like waiting on someone who isn't coming when called. Number 3. They noticed you didn't seek validation even when isolated. Isolation usually does something predictable to people. It makes them reach. They start explaining themselves too much, oversharing, softening their boundaries, or chasing reassurance just to feel seen again. That's normal. Humans are wired for feedback. What caught their attention was that you didn't do any of that. When connection was reduced or removed, You didn't scramble to replace it. You adjusted. They expected loneliness to push you into compromise. Instead, it clarified you. You didn't perform for approval or try to regain access by shrinking yourself. You didn't trade authenticity for acceptance. You stayed steady even when no one was clapping, watching, or validating the choices you were making. From the outside, that looks quiet. From a monitoring standpoint, it's unsettling. Most influence works through dependency. Approval becomes currency. Belonging becomes leverage. When someone is cut off from that, the usual reaction is to seek it somewhere else, anywhere else. You didn't. You didn't broadcast pain to attract sympathy. You didn't reshape yourself to fit the room you were no longer in. You carried on as if your internal compass didn't require an audience to stay accurate. They noticed you weren't trying to be misunderstood on purpose either. You simply didn't chase being understood. That difference matters. You didn't correct every assumption. You didn't clarify every misinterpretation. You let people believe what they wanted and continued forward without dragging their opinions along with you. That level of detachment isn't common because most people tie their identity to how they're perceived. What really disturbed them was the consistency. Isolation didn't erode your self-respect. Time alone didn't make you doubt your decisions. If anything, you became more precise, more selective, less willing to engage in noise. That told them your sense of self wasn't propped up by constant reflection from others. It was self-sustaining. In environments where attention equals power, someone who doesn't need attention becomes hard to move. They can't be starved into submission or rewarded into compliance. You didn't flinch when the room went quiet. You didn't beg the system to notice you again. You simply continued living in alignment with yourself. And that's the part they couldn't write cleanly into a report, because a person who remains grounded without validation isn't waiting to be rescued, approved of, or reinstated. They're already standing on solid ground, and that removes one of the oldest control mechanisms there is. Number 4, they admitted you weren't driven by fear of consequences. Most people operate like a chain of reactions, constantly calculating what happens if they fail, offend, or step out of line. Fear is the glue that keeps behavior predictable. Threats, deadlines, social pressure, they all work because people subconsciously prioritize avoiding negative outcomes. You didn't. That's what shook them the most. Every observer expected the usual choreography: corner someone, apply pressure, watch panic or compliance surface. But you didn't respond the way the manual said you would. You didn't flinch under scrutiny. You didn't bend to fit the expected mold. You didn't scramble to cover mistakes or appease authority. You moved according to your own assessment of the situation, not the imagined consequences others tried to impose. That absence of fear was interpreted as a kind of error in the human operating system, like a device running perfectly but ignoring all the warnings. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate detachment from the idea that danger or judgment should dictate your actions. They described it as anomalous because it defies conventional behavioral science. People who aren't motivated by fear are hard to read, harder to manipulate, and nearly impossible to predict. Every strategy they tried assumed fear existed as a lever. That lever didn't exist for you. They noticed it showed up in small ways, too. Subtle risks that normally cause hesitation were treated casually. Decisions that would make most people second-guess or overthink were executed smoothly, without internal alarm. When the expected chain reaction of stress, guilt, or defensiveness didn't happen, the monitors felt disoriented. They kept looking for cracks that never appeared, and the more they watched, the clearer it became. Fear had no purchase on you. Their usual tools, intimidation, coercion, manipulation, all relied on triggering a survival instinct. You were operating on choice, principle, and awareness rather than threat. That made you untouchable in ways they couldn't quantify, because they had nothing to hold on to, no buttons to push, no shortcuts to influence. A person who doesn't act out of fear can't be cornered or controlled. You didn't just survive observation, you rendered it irrelevant, turning their entire approach into a series of futile exercises that only highlighted their own misjudgment. Number 5. They found no consistent emotional access point. Every observer expects people to have a weak spot, a predictable doorway through which influence can enter. It could be pride, guilt, anger, desire, or fear. Everyone has something. It's how manipulation works. You didn't. They tried repeatedly in every possible combination, and every approach failed. Where there should have been a crack, there was nothing. Not emptiness, not coldness, not detachment, just an unshakable presence that didn't bend to expectation. They documented attempt after attempt. Push this button, they thought, and you'd react. Hit this angle, appeal to this instinct, and you'd respond. But every time, the expected reaction either didn't happen or completely shifted. What worked yesterday wouldn't work today. What appeared effective at one moment became irrelevant the next. Your responses weren't inconsistent in a chaotic way. They were fluid, adapting to circumstance without revealing internal patterns. That made every report look like a series of apologies disguised as analysis. They described it as non-standard and unreadable, but the truth went deeper. The absence of a fixed emotional access point meant they had no leverage over you. You couldn't be triggered predictably. You couldn't be baited into conflict, guilt, or compliance. They had nothing to attach their influence to, and that was terrifying. Power relies on entry points, on knowing where to press. You had none. Over time, this observation revealed another uncomfortable truth for them. The more they looked for vulnerability, the more they revealed their own assumptions and weaknesses. You weren't defensive. You weren't evasive. You were simply yourself, consistently grounded, and fundamentally inaccessible in the ways they were trained to expect. And that's the key. People who can't be influenced predictably are harder to control than any overtly aggressive opponent. The absence of a consistent emotional access point doesn't just frustrate, it dismantles the observer's framework entirely. They realized that by trying to map you, they had only exposed the limits of their own understanding. You weren't mysterious for show. You were unknowable because you weren't operating under their rules, and that made them powerless without them even admitting it. Number 6. They said your morality wasn't situational. Most people adjust their values depending on the room, the stakes, or who's watching. Survival often means bending the rules, compromising principles, or pretending to be someone you're not. That's normal. It's how humans navigate social pressure without breaking entirely. What terrified them about you was that you didn't do that. Your morality wasn't negotiable, and it wasn't performative. You acted according to your principles, not according to advantage, expectation, or fear. That level of consistency is rare, and it's unnerving to anyone trying to manipulate or control behavior. They documented instances where compromise would have been easy, opportunities to smooth over conflicts, to justify shortcuts, to save face. They were all ignored. You didn't chase expedience. You didn't rationalize bending your own rules for approval or survival. You lost things, yes, but not yourself. That refusal to trade integrity for convenience left observers baffled. In their reports, words like uncommon and unpredictable loyalty to principle kept recurring, because it didn't fit their usual models of behavior. The unsettling part for them wasn't just your consistency, it was the power it implied. People who bend are easier to influence. People who trade integrity for gain are easy to predict. People who act situationally can be controlled by leverage, fear, or reward. You weren't any of those things. You were principled even when it cost you. That made you resistant to manipulation and immune to the usual tactics of social engineering. They tried testing limits, presenting moral dilemmas that normally cause hesitation or rationalization. You didn't waver, you didn't debate endlessly. You responded in line with your internal standards and moved on. That ability to make decisions based on personal code rather than situational pressure revealed a rare form of independence. No one could rewrite your ethics because they weren't negotiable. What frightened them the most was subtle but profound. Someone whose morality isn't situational can't be corralled, bargained with, or predicted in the ways they rely on. You didn't just resist control, you rendered the very concept irrelevant. And that's why they couldn't stop returning the same observation over and over. Your principles were unshakable, and nothing they tried could alter them. Number 7. They reported that you noticed things you were never supposed to notice. Every person paid to watch you expected gaps, blind spots where things could hide, where influence could slip through unnoticed. That's how observation normally works. But with you, every subtle inconsistency, every minor shift in timing or tone, every barely there movement was registered. You noticed things that shouldn't have been visible. It wasn't just attention to detail, it was an awareness that seemed to operate on a level beyond what they considered possible. They tracked patterns, movements, conversations, even micro-expressions, expecting that someone under constant scrutiny would miss small things while being overwhelmed by constant observation. They were wrong. You didn't get distracted. You didn't get trapped in the noise. You picked up what mattered, often long before anyone tried to make it obvious. Reports repeatedly highlighted that your perception wasn't reactive, it was anticipatory. You understood context and consequence without anyone pointing it out. That unnerved them because it exposed a flaw in their own process. The more they tried to hide patterns, the more you saw them. This wasn't about intelligence or memory. It was about an ability to absorb subtle shifts, understand energy, and detect inconsistencies that observers assumed were invisible. They noted that their usual methods, misdirection, omission, even deception, had almost no effect. When they tried to test you, to insert false cues or fabricate scenarios, you spotted the irregularities instantly, often without acknowledging them. The reports called it uncanny, disturbingly accurate, and sometimes, very hesitantly, beyond expected limits. What made this terrifying for them wasn't just the noticing, it was what it implied. If you could see things they assumed were hidden, then any strategy, any manipulation, any attempt to control outcomes was already compromised. They had no room to maneuver without you understanding it, and that realization crept into every single report. You weren't snooping. You weren't paranoid. You weren't obsessed. You were just aware. And that level of awareness, paired with restraint and precision, turns the act of observation on its head. It shifts the power dynamic completely, leaving the watchers exposed and the observed untouchable. That's why every person who monitored you returned with the same unnerving conclusion. Nothing they thought was secret stayed hidden from you. Number 8, they described your calm as non-performative. What unsettled them wasn't that you stayed calm. Plenty of people act calm. They rehearse it. They suppress reactions, posture confidence, or wear composure like a mask. Yours didn't look like that. There was no stiffness, no forced neutrality, no emotional strain leaking through the cracks. Your calm didn't look maintained. It looked natural, like it wasn't costing you anything to hold it. They paid close attention, waiting for signs of effort, micro-frustrations, delayed tension, a moment where the act would slip. It never did. Under pressure, your breathing didn't change, your tone didn't sharpen. Your body language didn't betray inner chaos. That's when the reports shifted. Because calm that isn't performative can't be dismantled. There's nothing to provoke, nothing to peel back. They tried escalation, more pressure, more noise, more unpredictability. Usually that exposes the difference between someone who is composed and someone who is pretending to be. With you, escalation did nothing. The calm stayed the same, not flatter, not colder, just steady. That told them something uncomfortable. You weren't regulating yourself in response to the environment. You were already regulated before anything happened. What made this harder to accept was that your calm didn't seek admiration. You weren't using it to dominate, intimidate, or look superior. You didn't weaponize silence or posture. You didn't slow conversations to control the room. You weren't performing strength. You were simply present. That stripped away their usual explanations. If calm isn't a tactic, then it's a trait, and traits aren't easily dismantled. They noted that even when things didn't go your way, the calm didn't collapse into resentment or withdrawal. You acknowledged outcomes without dramatizing them. You adjusted without spiraling. That consistency made them uneasy because it suggested emotional stability that wasn't dependent on winning, approval, or control. In systems built on reaction, someone who doesn't react becomes a problem. Your calm didn't invite engagement or conflict. It quietly neutralized both. And that's why they couldn't categorize it as confidence, detachment, or discipline. It was something deeper, an internal steadiness that didn't need to prove itself. That kind of calm can't be taught quickly, can't be shaken easily, and can't be used against you. And once they realized it wasn't an act, they understood something else too. There was nothing to break. Number 9. They realized you didn't internalize false narratives about yourself. Most people carry the stories others tell them, often without realizing it. Criticism becomes self-doubt. Lies become shame. Labels stick because the mind, left unchecked, starts to accept them as truth. That's why manipulation works so effectively. Once someone believes a distorted version of themselves, control is easy. You didn't. Every report highlighted that no matter what narratives were spun around you, no matter how often people tried to rewrite your identity, you refused to internalize them. Observers tried to provoke reactions by painting you in false ways, by framing situations to suggest you were weak, incompetent, or flawed. Normally, this works. Most people fight the narrative, justify themselves endlessly, or start to accept parts of it over time. You didn't. You didn't argue unnecessarily. You didn't prove your worth. You didn't adjust to match expectations. You remained anchored in your own understanding of yourself, immune to the distortions being thrown at you. That shocked them because it defied every principle of social psychology they relied on. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't ignorance. You weren't blind to what others said or did. You simply refused to let it shape your internal truth. That refusal created a kind of unshakable foundation. No matter the intensity of scrutiny or the cleverness of deception, your sense of self remained intact. Every attempt to unsettle you fell flat, leaving the observers scrambling for new angles, new tactics, and new words to explain the impossible. They recorded again and again that you didn't react the way a normal person would. They called it resistant to projection and self-referentially stable. Those are professional ways of saying they couldn't find a point to exploit, a crack to wedge into, or a door to rewrite the story they were constructing. By refusing to internalize lies or distortions, you denied them the power that most people hand over without realizing it. You weren't just surviving manipulation, you were nullifying it entirely. Observers left each report acknowledging the same unsettling truth. Controlling the external world Doesn't matter if someone can't be controlled from within, and that was exactly where you operated, untouchable, unshakable, and fully yourself. Number 10. They said you adapted faster than the environment changed. Observation usually relies on lag. People move, react, and adjust slowly, giving monitors time to record, analyze, and predict the next step. They expected the same from you. What they got was something entirely different. By the time circumstances shifted, you had already adjusted. You weren't playing catch-up. You weren't reacting in real time to changes. They were already behind you. Every observer reported it with a mix of awe and disbelief. They tried to create scenarios where delays should have exposed you. They manipulated context, introduced complications, applied pressure. Most people would stumble, hesitate, or misstep while recalibrating. You didn't. You moved in sync with the outcome, not with the stimulus. It was as if you existed slightly ahead of the timeline, operating in a rhythm they couldn't measure or predict. That made every attempt to catch you useless. And every report admitted the frustration plainly. Their methods were ineffective. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't luck repeated by coincidence. The consistency of your adaptation showed a level of situational awareness that was both deliberate and deeply integrated. You didn't overreact to change. You didn't cling to old strategies that no longer applied. You didn't wait for permission, affirmation, or guidance. You recalibrated instantly, moving with clarity and efficiency. Observers tried to describe it in professional language: rapid situational recalibration, preemptive response alignment, environmental synchronicity beyond expected norms. In plain terms, you were impossible to pin down. The unsettling part for them wasn't just that you adapted quickly, it was that speed was paired with precision. Adaptation without misstep, adjustment without loss. You weren't chaotic, you weren't reactive, you were effective. And that effectiveness left observers exposed because they were trained to expect error, hesitation, and correction, and none of it appeared. In short, by the time they understood what was happening, it was already history. They were always chasing, always observing, and always a step behind. And when the people meant to monitor you find themselves perpetually outpaced, the balance of control flips entirely, leaving the observer powerless and the observed untouchable. Number 11. They noticed you weren't motivated by proving anything. Most people operate under the constant pressure to validate themselves. Whether it's to gain approval, silence critics, or show the world they're competent, there's always a performance being measured. That's how social and professional hierarchies function, through displays, defenses, and subtle competitions for recognition. You didn't play that game. Observers reported again and again that no matter the situation, you weren't driven by the need to prove yourself. You didn't argue to win. You didn't over-explain to justify decisions. You didn't perform feats of competence to earn admiration. That absence of need was profoundly disorienting. They tried to provoke it. Criticism, exclusion, direct challenges. They expected at least a flicker of defensive instinct. Usually when someone is questioned, even subtly, there's an internal scramble to protect reputation. With you, there wasn't. You didn't scramble. You didn't justify. You didn't react to restore an image. You acted according to your own standards, on your own terms, without concern for external validation. Observers struggled to document it properly because their frameworks didn't account for someone who could operate entirely outside the social currency of proving worth. What unsettled them most was the ripple effect. Without the need to prove yourself, you didn't play by their invisible rules. You didn't seek approval or recognition, which meant traditional levers of influence, praise, threat, or manipulation, had no effect. People who monitor others rely on this instinctive drive for acknowledgement to measure, predict, and control behavior. Remove it, and everything becomes unpredictable. This also revealed a deeper layer. Your decisions were independent, intentional, and self-referenced. You weren't silent or passive. You were deliberate. Your actions carried weight precisely because they weren't aimed at convincing anyone else of your value. That kind of independence shifts dynamics subtly but completely. By the time the observers realized what was happening, they were watching someone untethered from the usual pressures, untouchable by the systems they relied on, and completely unbothered by the judgments that guide most human behavior. That's why every report circled back to the same unsettling truth. Trying to control or predict someone who doesn't feel the need to prove themselves is like chasing a shadow. It can't be pinned down, influenced, or cornered. Number 12. They admitted you carried authority without dominance. Most people assume authority comes with force, loudness, intimidation, or visible control. Leaders are measured by how much they assert, how much they push, and how clearly they demand compliance. You didn't operate that way. Observers reported that your presence carried weight, but it wasn't aggressive. You didn't command attention. You didn't pressure people to follow. You didn't rely on fear, force, or hierarchy to create influence. Yet influence existed. People listened. Decisions aligned, energy shifted. That kind of authority is rare, and it unnerved everyone watching because it can't be challenged in conventional ways. They tried to test it. They looked for cracks, moments where your calm, your silence, or your restraint would fail. They applied pressure, attempted confrontation, and even created conflict to provoke dominance-based responses. Every time, nothing changed. Your authority remained, quietly present, but never forced. That's when the reports began to use terms like inherently influential and gravity without weight, professional ways of admitting they didn't know how to categorize it. What terrified them wasn't just that you were respected or listened to, it was that your influence couldn't be bargained with, bought, or intimidated. There was no door to push, no ladder to climb, no trick to manipulate. Traditional control tactics failed because authority that doesn't rely on dominance isn't fragile. You didn't need to prove superiority or demand compliance. Your presence alone shifted the environment. Observers documented how people naturally deferred, followed, or adjusted without coercion. It wasn't about submission, it was recognition. That recognition didn't come from fear or admiration either. It came from acknowledgement that you operated from clarity, confidence, and decisiveness. There was no performance, no posturing. It was simply understood. That type of authority changes dynamics quietly but profoundly. It destabilizes those who try to assert conventional power because they assume everyone responds the same way they do. When authority isn't enforced, it can't be resisted. Observers repeatedly noted that they had no leverage, no predictability, and no frame to manipulate it. You weren't dominating, you weren't loud, you weren't performing, and that made you untouchable in a way most people cannot comprehend. Number 13. They reported that prolonged observation changed them, not you. Every professional assigned to watch you expected the usual dynamic. Someone under scrutiny starts to crack, bends to the pressure, or at least reveals predictable habits over time. That's how observation works. They assumed time would expose weaknesses, create patterns, and give them leverage. What happened instead was entirely different. The longer they watched, the more the experience seemed to reflect back on them. They began questioning their own assumptions, their own methods, and, in subtle ways, even their own sense of control. Reports repeatedly mentioned it. The process of monitoring you didn't yield the expected insights into your behavior. It revealed inconsistencies, doubts, and blind spots within the observers themselves. Every time they tried to anticipate your next move, they were forced to acknowledge gaps in their reasoning. Every time they attempted to predict your reaction, they found their frameworks failing. The observation, which should have strengthened their position, instead magnified their own uncertainty. They noted small but telling patterns. Frustration crept in. Notes became longer, more convoluted, often repeating the same observations in search of meaning. Analysts started second-guessing each other. Supervisors debated interpretations endlessly. The reports themselves grew heavier with disclaimers, contradictions, and admissions of unexplained behavior. Their focus shifted from watching you to managing their own discomfort with what they were witnessing. What made this unnerving was that you weren't doing anything confrontational. You weren't resisting actively or antagonizing anyone. You simply existed according to your own rhythm, principles, and awareness. Your consistency highlighted their inconsistencies. Your groundedness reflected their internal chaos. Over time, the act of trying to understand you became a mirror they couldn't put down. By the end, every observer admitted the same uneasy truth. The longer they studied you, the more the work revealed about their own limitations, biases, and blind spots. You didn't need to react, strategize, or manipulate. Time itself did the work for you. Their process, intended to gain insight and control, ended up exposing them instead. And that realization, the fact that observation had backfired entirely, was reported repeatedly, almost with a mix of frustration and awe. You weren't changed by scrutiny. They were. Number 14. They concluded you weren't operating from survival anymore. Most people live with survival as their baseline. Decisions, reactions, even small daily choices are filtered through the lens of self-preservation, avoiding danger, minimizing loss, staying within the predictable patterns that feel safe. That's what observers expected. They assumed that pressure, threat, or manipulation would push you into reactive survival mode. Every report emphasized with increasing disbelief that you weren't functioning that way at all. You weren't reacting out of fear. You weren't calculating moves to avoid consequences. You weren't constantly scanning for threats or scanning for ways to mitigate risk. You acted from choice, not instinct. Each decision was deliberate, measured, and rooted in principle rather than necessity. That distinction is subtle, but it's catastrophic to anyone trying to monitor or control you. When survival is the driving force, people can be predicted, cornered, or manipulated. Remove survival as the motive, and suddenly all the levers they rely on disappear. Observers documented that your actions had clarity, precision, and purpose, even in high-pressure situations where most people would panic or scramble. Opportunities to react defensively, to hedge bets, to bow to influence, were ignored. You didn't compromise, you didn't overthink, and you didn't second-guess yourself. Your movements weren't just calm, they were intentional. You weren't surviving circumstances, you were navigating them with full awareness and autonomy. That was what terrified them most. Not the skill, not the composure, not even the awareness itself. It was the fact that you were untouchable in a way no system or strategy could counter. They realized that someone who isn't acting to survive can't be corralled, pressured, or predicted. Leverage no longer exists when the person being observed operates from freedom rather than fear. By the end, every observer who filed reports came to the same conclusion. Your actions weren't dictated by what might happen to you. You weren't reacting to pressure, danger, or judgment. You weren't trying to stay safe. You were operating from your own internal authority, moving with choice rather than survival, and that made you untouchable, uncontainable, and fundamentally unaccountable to anyone else's expectations. Every single report, every observation, every attempt to map, measure, or control you ended the same way. Baffled, frustrated, and increasingly aware that they were watching someone who couldn't be predicted, cornered, or contained. You didn't operate according to their rules. You weren't a puzzle they could solve, a system they could hack, or a pattern they could exploit. From your ability to remain unreadable and unshakable, to noticing things they assumed were invisible, to refusing to internalize lies or compromise your principles, you existed outside the playbook they relied on. Your calm wasn't performance, your timing wasn't reactive, your morality wasn't negotiable, your authority wasn't forced, your independence wasn't conditional. Every single layer of their strategy crumbled because you weren't operating from fear, survival, or the need to prove anything. You weren't just resisting influence, you were rendering their entire methodology meaningless. And here's the striking truth they had to admit over and over again. Their focus, energy, and frustration were exposing more about them than you. Observation wasn't shaping you, it was revealing their limits. Every detail they thought was hidden, every subtle move they hoped would destabilize you, every narrative they tried to force, they all failed. By the time they realized it, it wasn't you who had changed. It was them. Watching you expose the cracks in their assumptions, the blind spots in their understanding, and the failure of their control. You didn't just survive scrutiny, you redefined the entire meaning of being observed. This is why every single person they paid to monitor you came back reporting the same unnerving conclusion. Nothing they thought they understood applied to you. You existed beyond manipulation, beyond predictability, beyond the rules they tried to impose. You were untouchable, not because of what you did, but because of who you inherently were. And when you operate from that place, self-referenced, principled, and unstoppable, control becomes irrelevant, influence becomes meaningless, and observation becomes powerless. If this revelation hit you the way it should, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel for more insights that break down the rules they never expected to be broken. Like, comment, and share this video with anyone who needs to understand what it means to operate untouchable, unshakable, and beyond the reach of ordinary control. The truth about observation, power, and independence isn't for everyone, but those who see it can never unsee it. God bless you.